The sterling ballroom at the plaza glittered under crystal chandeliers. 300 guests dressed in their finest silks and tailored wool. Champagne flutes caught the light like captured
We're
stars.
so glad you could make it.
Victoria
Means a lot,
Hayes
man.
stood at the
Wouldn't
entrance
miss
in a
it.
navy
Congratulations.
dress that
Thanks.
cost less than most women in this room spent on shoes, but she wore it like armor. Beside her, Ethan Cole adjusted the cuffs of his gray Brooks Brothers suit, bought off the rack 5 years ago, pressed this morning in his Brooklyn brownstone while Sophie ate cereal and asked if he was nervous. He wasn't nervous then. He was now. Whispers rippled through the crowd the moment they crossed the threshold. Eyes tracked them like predators assessing prey. A woman in Oscar de la Renta leaned toward her companion, lips barely moving. A man in Tom Ford checked his Rolex as if timing how long this spectacle would last. Ethan felt the weight of their judgment settle across his shoulders, familiar as an old coat. He'd spent 4 years building a life where nobody looked at him this way. 4 years of deliberate invisibility, of choosing coffee shops where nobody asked questions, and playgrounds where other fathers only cared if you could throw a decent spiral to the kids. Victoria's hand tightened on his arm. Her mother stood near the altar, spine straight as rebar, wearing Ralph Lauren black and a smile that could cut glass. Diana Hayes had perfected the art of looking through people she deemed beneath notice. Ethan had seen that look before, back when he wore better suits and sat in boardrooms where men calculated your net worth before learning your name. The ceremony began. Natalie Hayes, Victoria's younger sister, softer around the edges where Victoria had learned to harden, floated down the aisle in white silk. The groom waited at the altar, Ryan Mitchell in a Tom Ford tuxedo that probably cost more than Ethan's truck. Ryan's hands were steady, his smile genuine. 3 years ago, those hands had shaken when he'd sat across from Ethan in a coffee shop in Midtown, desperate and broke, pitching a company everyone else had already rejected. The officiant's voice rolled through the ballroom like distant thunder. Dearly beloved, gathered here today. The familiar liturgy of commitment and hope. Ethan watched Ryan's face, waiting for the moment of recognition that would shatter everything. But Ryan's eyes stayed locked on his bride, and Ethan allowed himself to breathe. Victoria leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for being here." He wanted to tell her the truth right then, wanted to pull her aside and explain everything before the world did it for him. But the moment passed, swallowed by the swell of a string quartet as Natalie took her place beside the man she loved. 6 weeks earlier, Ethan had sat in the corner of the Turning Page, a bookstore cafe wedged between a dry cleaner and a bakery on a quiet block in Park Slope. The place smelled like old paper and dark roast, the kind of smell that made you want to stay a while. Tuesday morning, 7:30, the hour when the neighborhood belonged to people who had nowhere urgent to be. A college student typed furiously near the window, her laptop plastered with stickers from bands Ethan had never heard of. An older man read the Times by the register, turning pages with the deliberate care of someone who still believed in print journalism. Ethan's corner table faced the street, giving him a clear view of everyone who entered. Not paranoia, just habit. He didn't spend 12 years learning to read people's intentions without developing a preference for walls at your back. His coffee had gone lukewarm while he stared at the same page in a book about post-war architecture, not really reading, just existing in the comfortable anonymity of a place where nobody knew EC. Venture funded half the tech startups in New York. Mrs. Chen emerged from behind the counter with a fresh pot, her 70-year-old frame moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been refilling cups for 40 years. She'd bought this place when Park Slope was still affordable, back when Brooklyn meant something different than it did now. "You need a warm-up, Ethan?" He slid his cup toward her. "Thanks, Mrs. Chen." "How's Sophie doing?" She like that new teacher? Loves her. Came home yesterday talking about photosynthesis like she'd discovered fire. Mrs. Chen smiled, the kind of smile that said she remembered when her own kids had brought home that same wonder. You're a good father. Sarah would be proud. The familiar ache settled in his chest. 4 years since the funeral, and her name still landed like a fist. Not because he missed her. He did, in the complicated way you missed someone who'd been both your anchor and your betrayal. But because of what she'd said 2 weeks before the cancer finally won. I don't know if I ever loved you, Ethan, or if I just loved what you could give me. She'd been on enough morphine that he could have pretended she didn't mean it, could have written it off as pain talking, fear talking, anything but truth. But her eyes had been clear when she said it, and clear when she'd added, I'm sorry I couldn't figure it out in time. He'd held her hand until she fell asleep, then walked out of that hospital room and made a decision. Nobody would ever love E.C. Venture again. They could love Ethan Cole, the guy who fixed his own plumbing and built wooden toy boxes for his daughter and read books about things that had nothing to do with making money. But the man who'd turned 14 startups into billion-dollar companies, that man was going to stay buried. His phone buzzed against the table. Another founder wanting 15 minutes of his time, as if time could be parceled out in quarters like coins in a meter. He swiped the notification away without reading it. 3 more messages lit up the screen in quick succession. An investor from California, a CEO who'd heard through the grapevine that EC Venture might be interested in medical tech, a journalist from Bloomberg who'd been chasing the story for 2 years, trying to put a face to the ghost. Ethan powered the phone down completely and returned to his book, to the careful documentation of how architects had rebuilt German cities after everything burned. There was something honest about starting from ash, about having no choice but to build new rather than renovate old. The door opened. A woman stepped inside, and Ethan's careful anonymity fractured. He recognized her immediately. Victoria Hayes, though she'd never know he knew. Her picture had been in Forbes 3 months ago, a profile about the youngest female CEO in enterprise software, 38 years old and running a company her father had built from nothing. In the photo, she'd worn a charcoal suit and the kind of expression that said she was done explaining herself to rooms full of men who thought they knew better. The woman who ordered coffee at the counter looked nothing like that photo. Jeans worn soft at the knees, an oversized gray sweater that had seen better days, hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry except a simple silver bracelet that caught the light when she reached for her wallet. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying weight that never got lighter. She paid for her coffee, black, no sugar, no room for cream, and scanned the cafe for a place to sit. Her eyes passed over Ethan without recognition, which was exactly how he preferred it. She chose the table directly across from his, set down her laptop, and proceeded to ignore his existence with the kind of focus that suggested she'd had a lot of practice ignoring things. For 20 minutes they occupied the same space without acknowledgement. She typed with the aggressive precision of someone deleting more than they were keeping. He turned pages in his book without absorbing a single word. The college student packed up and left. The old man folded his newspaper with a satisfied sigh and shuffled out into the September morning. Mrs. Chen hummed something that might have been Sinatra while she wiped down tables. Victoria's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. She sat back in her chair, closed her eyes, and pressed her palms against her temples like she was trying to keep her skull from splitting apart. Ethan knew that gesture. He'd made it himself often enough in the years when work meant 18-hour days and sleep meant dreaming about equity structures. Her eyes opened and found him watching. He looked away immediately, but not fast enough. Does it ever feel like silence is louder than noise? The question hung in the air between them, not quite directed at him, not quite talking to herself. Ethan considered pretending he hadn't heard, considered returning to his book and letting the moment pass. But something in her voice, raw and unguarded in a way that made him think she hadn't meant to speak out loud, made him respond. Every day. She studied him for a long moment, and he wondered what she saw. A man in his early 40s, hair going gray at the temples, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt like he'd just come from a construction site. Hands that showed the wear of someone who built things with them. A Timex watch that had belonged to his father. Nothing about him screamed money or power or the ability to write checks that changed lives. I thought it was just me. It's never just you. The world's full of people trying to find quiet. Are you one of them? Ethan closed his book, giving her his full attention for the first time. I used to think I was looking for quiet. Turned out, I was just looking for honest. Something shifted in her expression, a door opening just wide enough to let in light. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. They sat in comfortable silence for another 10 minutes before she packed up her laptop and left without another word. He thought that would be the end of it. One strange conversation with a stranger, the kind of New York moment that felt significant while it lasted and dissolved like morning fog. But the next Thursday she came back. Same table, same coffee, same tired eyes. She worked in silence while Ethan read about the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright's final years. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The cafe became a shared space where the rules of outside didn't apply, where nobody performed and nobody asked questions that required anything more than surface answers. It went on like that for 3 weeks. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7:30 to 9:30, 2 people learning to be comfortable in each other's orbit without collision. Ethan found himself looking forward to those mornings in a way that surprised him. Not because anything happened, nothing did, but because nothing had to. Victoria's presence required nothing from him except his own, and that was a gift he hadn't known he needed. The 4th Tuesday, she forgot her charger. Her laptop died halfway through whatever she was working on, the screen going black with a finality that made her swear under her breath. She closed the computer with more force than necessary, then sat back and stared at the ceiling like it might have answers. I hate feeling trapped. Ethan looked up from his book. Trapped by what? Everything. Work, family, expectations. The person I'm supposed to be versus the person I actually am. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sorry, you didn't sign up for therapy. I'm not charging by the hour, so you're good. She looked at him properly then, really looked, and he felt the weight of her intelligence cataloging details. The book he was reading, the calluses on his palms, the lack of wedding ring, the way he held his coffee cup like someone who'd learned to make a single cup last 2 hours. What's your name? Ethan. Victoria. She didn't offer a last name. He didn't ask for one. They sat with their names hanging in the air between them, 2 people who'd chosen to be strangers together. What do you do, Ethan? I help people build things. Used to work in finance, high level, but I walked away after my wife died. The truth, but not all of it. The kind of half-truth that opened doors without revealing what was behind them. Victoria nodded like she understood the weight of words left unspoken. I run a company, or it runs me. I haven't figured out which yet. Maybe both. Maybe that's the trap. Maybe. She pulled her sweater sleeves down over her hands, a gesture so young and unguarded that Ethan felt something shift in his chest. You ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you woke up one day and realized you'd been following a script you never agreed to? Ethan thought about Sarah's deathbed confession, about the years he'd spent building EC Venture from nothing, proving he could succeed on his own terms, only to realize that success without recognition was just a different kind of cage. About Sophie asking him last week why he never talked about his work, and his inability to explain that talking about it would mean admitting it existed. More often than I'd like. Victoria smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Small and sad and entirely real. Good. I'd hate to be the only one. They talked for another hour after that, trading stories that revealed nothing concrete and everything important. She told him about her father dying at his desk 6 years ago, how she'd found him slumped over a quarterly report, how she'd taken over the company because nobody else could, and because some part of her thought it would make him proud. He told her about Sophie, about trying to raise an 8-year-old daughter who was too smart for her own good, about the particular terror of being the only parent standing between your child and a world that would break her if given half a chance. Neither of them mentioned money or status or the machinery of their professional lives. They talked like people, and that was rarer than either of them wanted to admit. When Victoria finally left, laptop dead, work undone, looking somehow lighter than when she'd arrived, Ethan sat alone with his cold coffee and wondered what he'd started. Wondered if this was the beginning of something that mattered, or just another way of hiding from the truth of who he was. His phone stayed off in his pocket. Outside, Brooklyn went about its business, oblivious. The weeks accumulated like snow, silent and inevitable. Tuesday and Thursday mornings became the architecture of Ethan's life, the foundation everything else was built around. He dropped Sophie at school, watched her disappear into the building with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, then drove to the turning page and waited for Victoria to arrive. She was never late, never missed a day, as consistent as tide. They talked more now, but carefully, like archaeologists excavating something fragile. She mentioned her mother in passing, pressure to marry someone appropriate, whoever that meant. He talked about Sophie's obsession with space, how she'd checked out every book the library had on astronomy, and now insisted they identify constellations before bedtime. Victoria admitted she'd minored in architecture at Cornell, that she still sketched building designs on napkins when she thought nobody was watching, that she'd never pursued it because her father had needed her in the family business, and by the time he was gone, it felt too late to choose a different path. It's never too late. Ethan heard himself say the words and felt their weight, the hypocrisy of advice he'd never taken. Says the man hiding in a Brooklyn cafe. I'm not hiding. I'm recovering. From what? From being someone I wasn't sure I liked. Victoria went quiet after that, staring at her coffee like it might offer commentary. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough that he had to lean forward to hear it. I think I'm still being someone I don't like. I just don't know how to stop. The honesty of it hit him square in the chest. He wanted to tell her then, wanted to lay out the whole truth about EC Venture and the fortune he'd built in shadows, and the reason he understood her particular prison better than she'd ever guess. But the moment wasn't right. The timing was wrong. He told himself he was being careful, being strategic, being protective of what they'd built in this small cafe where the rules of the outside world didn't reach. Later, alone in his brownstone while Sophie slept upstairs, he'd recognize it for what it was. Cowardice dressed up as caution. The 7th week, Victoria arrived looking worse than he'd ever seen her. Eyes red-rimmed, makeup absent, wearing what looked like yesterday's clothes. She ordered 3 shots of espresso, slammed them back at the counter, then sat down across from him with the energy of someone barely holding themselves together. "Bad day?" She laughed, hollow and sharp. "Bad year. Bad decade. Bad life." Ethan closed his book, giving her his full attention. Victoria pulled out her phone, scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward him. An email from her mother, time-stamped 2 a.m. The message was short and surgical. Victoria was 38. Natalie was getting married. When was Victoria going to stop pretending her career was enough to fill the void where a family should be? Christopher would be disappointed to see his daughter alone. Diana was only saying this because she cared, because someone had to be honest, because Victoria needed to hear it. Ethan read it twice, feeling anger rise in his throat like bile. That's not care. That's control. She's not wrong, though. I am alone. I do use work to avoid having a life. Victoria took the phone back, stared at the message like she was memorizing it. Maybe I am exactly what she says. You're here, aren't you? That's not work. This is hiding. Maybe hiding is what you need right now. Victoria looked at him then, really looked, and he saw something crack open in her expression. The armor she wore to board meetings and investor calls and family dinners, all of it peeling away to reveal the raw exhaustion underneath. I wish I could disappear. Just stop being Victoria Hayes for a while and figure out who I'd be if nobody was watching. Ethan understood that wish in ways she couldn't imagine. He'd spent 4 years living it, and he still wasn't sure if it was liberation or just another kind of cage. The words that came next slipped out before he could stop them, before he could calculate whether they were wise or kind or fair. Being invisible is a privilege, but it's also a prison. Something in his tone made Victoria tilt her head, studying him with renewed intensity. Ethan felt exposed under that gaze, like she could see through all his careful construction to the truth buried underneath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the cafe humming with its usual morning soundtrack, espresso machine hissing, pages turning, Mrs. Chen singing softly in Mandarin while she restocked pastries. You're not just some guy who helps people build things, are you? The question landed like a blade between ribs. Ethan considered his options, weighed truth against comfort, and chose the path he'd been choosing for 4 years. The wrong path, though he wouldn't admit it for weeks yet. I'm exactly who I said I was. I just used to be more of it. Victoria nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer because she was carrying her own secrets and understood the weight of things left unsaid. They moved on to safer topics after that, but something had shifted. She'd seen a crack in his foundation, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before the rest came tumbling down. The 8th week brought rain, the kind of September storm that turned New York streets into rivers and made everyone irritable. Ethan arrived at the turning page drenched, despite his jacket, water dripping from his hair onto the worn wooden floor. Mrs. Chen took one look at him and disappeared into the back, returning with a towel that had seen better days but was clean and warm. You're going to catch pneumonia running around in weather like this. Sophie needed her lunch. She forgot it at home. Mrs. Chen shook her head, the universal gesture of mothers everywhere who knew their charges were hopeless. That girl has you wrapped around her finger. Completely. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, somehow managing to look elegant, even soaked to the bone. She'd been in Midtown for an early meeting, got caught in the downpour walking between Subway and cafe. Her laptop bag was waterproof, but her jacket wasn't, and she shivered slightly as she ordered her usual coffee. Ethan watched her from his corner, watched the way she held herself together even when falling apart, and felt something dangerous taking root in his chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that this woman mattered in ways that went beyond pleasant conversation and shared silence. His phone sat on the table, powered on for the first time in weeks because Sophie's school had called earlier about a possible exposure to strep throat. The screen lit up with a message notification, and in the second before Ethan could flip it face down, Victoria's eyes tracked to it. He saw her see it, saw the moment her expression changed from casual interest to sharp focus. The message preview was visible for maybe 2 seconds, but that was enough. R. Mitchell, meeting confirmed for next week. Board is very excited. Thank you again for believing in us when no one else would. Ethan grabbed the phone, tucked it into his jacket pocket, but the damage was done. Victoria sat down across from him, and her body language had changed. Still friendly, still warm, but with a new layer of calculation underneath. She was trying to place the pieces, figure out the puzzle she'd only just realized existed. You're busier than you let on. Casual words, loaded question. Ethan forced himself to meet her eyes, to hold steady under scrutiny. Just helping an old friend with some business advice. Nothing exciting. What kind of advice? Investment strategy, mostly. How to structure his next funding round. All true, all deliberately incomplete. Victoria nodded, sipped her coffee, and changed the subject to something neutral about the weather. But Ethan knew he'd just started a clock ticking. She'd seen enough to be curious, and Victoria Hayes hadn't built a tech company by ignoring curious. That night, alone in his brownstone after Sophie went to bed, Ethan did what he should have done weeks ago. He searched Victoria's name properly, read the Forbes profile and the TechCrunch interviews, and the Wall Street Journal piece about Hayes Technologies expanding into enterprise AI. He learned that her father had started the company in his garage in 1987, bootstrapped it to $50 million in revenue, then took it public in 2008, right before the financial collapse. That Victoria had joined straight out of Cornell with her architecture degree gathering dust, worked her way up through product management and operations, and been appointed CEO 6 years ago when Christopher Hayes died at his desk from a heart attack nobody saw coming. He learned that she was brilliant, demanding, and desperately lonely in ways the articles wouldn't name, but the photos showed clearly. Every public appearance she looked slightly lost, like someone searching for an exit that didn't exist. He could have told her the truth then, could have called or texted or waited until Thursday morning and laid it all out before she had time to dig deeper. Could have controlled the narrative the way he'd learned to control everything else about his public image by having no public image at all. Instead, he shut his laptop, climbed the stairs to Sophie's room, and stood in her doorway watching her sleep. She had Sarah's nose and his stubborn chin, and a heart that broke too easily when things didn't make sense. Last week she'd cried because a classmate said her lunch looked weird, and Ethan had spent an hour explaining that different didn't mean wrong, that the world was better for its variety, that she should never shrink herself to make other people comfortable. Advice he'd never managed to follow himself. Daddy? Sophie's eyes opened, groggy and confused. Ethan crossed to her bed, sat on the edge, brushed hair back from her forehead. Sorry, sweetheart. Didn't mean to wake you. Were you watching me sleep? That's creepy. He laughed despite himself. Little bit, yeah. Is something wrong? Everything, he wanted to say. I've been lying by omission to someone I care about, and she's going to find out, and I don't know how to fix it without destroying what we've built. Instead, he kissed her forehead and pulled her blankets up higher. Nothing's wrong. Go back to sleep. Dad? Yeah? Are you lonely? The question caught him sideways, knocked something loose in his chest. He thought about lying, about protecting her from truths she was too young to carry. Then he remembered his own advice about honesty and swallowed hard. Sometimes. But I have you, so I'm never alone. That's not the same thing. 8 years old, and she'd already figured out what took most people decades to learn. Ethan squeezed her hand, throat too tight for words. No, he managed finally. It's not. The next Thursday, Victoria showed up with purpose in her stride. She sat down across from Ethan and pulled out her laptop, but instead of working, she turned the screen toward him. A Bloomberg article from 2 years ago, archived and detailed, about a mysterious investor called EC Venture, who'd funded 14 startups in 8 years with a success rate that bordered on supernatural. 12 of the 14 had reached unicorn status, billion-dollar valuations that made headlines and minted millionaires. The other 2 were still climbing. The article had no photos, no interviews, nothing but scattered references in SEC filings and grateful acknowledgments from founders who'd received checks when nobody else believed. EC Venture never took board seats, never demanded control, just provided capital and walked away. The journalist had spent 6 months trying to identify the person behind the entity and come up empty. Interesting read, Victoria said, voice neutral. You ever hear of this person? Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face stayed calm. 4 years of practice hiding himself in plain sight paid dividends in moments like this. He glanced at the screen, read just enough to seem engaged, then shrugged. Rings a bell. Some angel investor, right? Keeps a low profile. Very low. Nobody knows who they are. Could be anyone. She closed the laptop, held his gaze. Could be someone sitting in a Brooklyn cafe pretending to be nobody. The accusation hung between them, soft and dangerous. Ethan could have deflected, could have laughed it off, could have built another wall between truth and performance. Instead, he chose a different kind of half-truth, one that felt more honest, even as it revealed nothing concrete. Why does it matter who they are? Maybe they just want to help people without making it about ego. Or maybe they're hiding from something. Maybe both. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Ethan watched her make a decision behind her eyes. She could push, could demand answers, could walk away if he refused to give them. Instead, she nodded slowly and changed the subject to something safer, and Ethan felt relief and disappointment in equal measure. He'd been given an out, and he'd taken it. Later, he'd regret that choice with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. 2 days later, Victoria invited him to her sister's wedding. They were on their second cups of coffee, talking about Sophie's upcoming school play, something about the solar system, where she'd been cast as Jupiter because her teacher said she had gravitas, when Victoria went quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something important was coming, words being weighed and measured before deployment. Natalie's getting married. My sister. 4 weeks from now. At the plaza. Ethan nodded, waiting. Victoria twisted her silver bracelet around her wrist, a nervous tell he'd noticed before when she was working up to something difficult. It's going to be huge. 300 people, mostly business contacts and family friends. My mother will be there in full force, probably with a checklist of acceptable men she thinks I should marry instead of wasting my time being single and successful. The bitterness in her voice could have stripped paint. I don't want to go alone. I don't want to spend 6 hours fielding questions about my personal life from people who think a woman without a husband is either a failure or a threat." She looked up, met his eyes directly. "Would you come with me?" The question landed like a punch he should have seen coming. Ethan's mind raced through implications, through the fact that Ryan Mitchell was marrying into the Hayes family, through the absolute certainty that Ryan would recognize him the moment they were in the same room. He'd saved NovaStream 3 years ago when the company was circling the drain, had written a check for $2 million in seed funding when every VC in New York had passed. Ryan had cried in that coffee shop, had promised he'd never forget it, had meant every word. Which meant this wedding would be the end of Ethan's invisibility, whether he wanted it or not. He should have said no. Should have explained right then that going would expose truths she deserved to hear from him first, in private, on terms they could both control. Should have respected her enough to give her the choice about whether to bring him into her family's orbit, knowing who he really was. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Your family will have questions about me." Let them question. I'll just say you're someone important to me. That's all they need to know. Someone important. The word settled into his chest, warm and dangerous. Et and Ethan thought about Sophie's question 2 nights ago, "Are you lonely?" and realized the answer was changing, had already changed, somewhere in the accumulated hours of coffee and conversation and comfortable silence. "When is it?" "November 18th, Saturday. Black tie optional, but knowing my mother, she'll judge anyone who shows up in anything less than Armani." Ethan looked down at his flannel shirt and work-worn jeans, at the Timex on his wrist and the coffee mug in his calloused hands. Looked at Victoria in her jeans and old sweater, stripped of all the armor she wore to board meetings, trusting him with a vulnerability she probably showed nobody else. He could still tell her. Could explain about EC Venture and Ryan Mitchell and the fact that attending this wedding would detonate whatever quiet life he'd built. Could give her the choice to rescind the invitation or brace for impact, or make any decision based on complete information instead of carefully curated fragments. "Okay," he heard himself say. "I'll go." Victoria's smile was pure relief, bright enough to hurt. "Really?" "Really." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, and Ethan felt the weight of what he'd just set in motion. He had 4 weeks to tell her the truth, 4 weeks to find the right moment, the right words, the right way to explain that he'd been lying by omission since the day they met. 4 weeks should have been enough time. He told himself it would be. The days accelerated after that, time collapsing in ways that left Ethan constantly off balance. He took Sophie to school and picked her up, helped with homework about ecosystems and food chains, built her a new bookshelf because the old one was overflowing with library books about space and biology and how things worked. He went to the turning page on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sat across from Victoria, and every time he opened his mouth to tell her the truth, something stopped him. A text from her about her mother calling again with opinions about Victoria's life choices. Sophie getting sick with a stomach bug that kept them both up for 2 nights straight. Victoria mentioning how much she hated her company's new product direction, but felt trapped by board expectations and her father's legacy. Each interruption felt like a sign, like the universe telling him to wait for the right moment. Later he'd recognize it for what it was, his own fear, dressed up as consideration. 3 weeks before the wedding, Victoria mentioned over coffee that she'd told her mother about him. Diana Hayes had immediately demanded details. Where did he work? Where did he go to school? What were his prospects? What could he offer her daughter beyond whatever middling existence he was currently living? Victoria had told her to mind her own business, which had gone about as well as expected. She sent me links to suits. For you. Victoria pulled out her phone, scrolled through an email with barely contained fury. Tom Ford, Hugo Boss, Brioni, all in the $5,000 range, because apparently she thinks I'd bring someone who can't dress himself properly. Ethan looked at the links, at price tags that meant nothing to him, but would mean everything to the room full of people who'd be judging his worth. He'd worn suits that expensive before, back when he sat in Morgan Stanley offices and made decisions about other people's money. He could afford 1,000 of them now and never noticed the expense. But showing up in designer labels would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer, would mark him as someone trying to perform wealth rather than someone who existed outside its orbit entirely. I'll wear what I always wear. If that's a problem for your mother, she can take it up with me. Victoria's expression softened, something fierce and grateful in her eyes. They're going to judge you. I know, but not for long. She frowned at that, clearly wanting to ask what he meant, but her phone rang before she could. Rachel Chen, her CFO, with another crisis that needed immediate attention. Victoria took the call outside, leaving Ethan alone with his coffee and his cowardice. He stared at his own phone, at Victoria's contact information, at how easy it would be to send a text right now. There's something I need to tell you. Can we meet somewhere private? 10 seconds of courage, and he could start undoing the tangle he'd made of both their lives. Instead, he slipped the phone back in his pocket and waited for Victoria to return, telling himself he'd do it next time. Next Tuesday, next Thursday, after Sophie's play, before the wedding. Soon. Always soon, and never now. 2 weeks before the wedding, Sophie asked the question that finally cracked through his denial. They were eating dinner at the kitchen table, spaghetti with marinara from a jar, garlic bread that was slightly burned, the kind of meal that would have made Sarah shake her head and order takeout. Sophie pushed pasta around her plate, building and destroying small structures with mechanical precision. Where are you going Saturday after next? To a wedding, remember? I told you about it. With the lady from the coffee shop. Her name is Victoria. Sophie looked up, and her eyes were too knowing for 8 years old. Are you going to marry her? Ethan nearly choked on his water. We're not. It's too early for that kind of talk. But you like her. No point lying to a child who could read him better than most adults. I do. Does she know about EC Venture? The question hit him like cold water, shocking in its directness. He'd been so careful never to discuss work at home, to keep those worlds separate, but Sophie was smart, and she paid attention, and she'd overheard enough phone calls and seen enough deposited checks to piece together that her father's consulting business was more than he claimed. How do you know about that? I heard you on the phone last month. You were talking to someone about NovaStream, and you called yourself EC Venture. She stabbed a meatball with her fork. I looked it up online. You're famous. Kind of. Ethan rubbed his face, torn between pride at her intelligence and horror at his own carelessness. I'm not famous. I'm anonymous. That's different. Does Victoria know? Not yet. Are you going to tell her? Yes. When? The question he'd been asking himself for weeks, dressed in the uncompromising clarity of a child's logic. Ethan looked at his daughter and saw judgment there. Not harsh, but present. Sophie had learned from watching him that honesty mattered, that you didn't hide important things from people you cared about. Now he was violating his own lessons, and she was smart enough to see the hypocrisy. Soon, he said, hating how weak it sounded. Sophie nodded, unconvinced, and went back to her pasta. The rest of dinner passed in silence, but Ethan felt the weight of her disappointment like a physical thing. After she went to bed, he sat on the couch staring at nothing, phone in hand, thumb hovering over Victoria's contact. This time, he actually typed the message. "I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet tomorrow?" His finger hovered over send for a full minute before he deleted it and set the phone down. Tomorrow, Victoria had back-to-back board meetings and a presentation to investors. He'd be adding stress to an already terrible day. Better to wait until she had time to process it properly, until they could sit down somewhere private and he could explain everything without rushing. Better to wait. Always waiting, and never acting. 3 days before the wedding, Ethan took Sophie to her grandmother's house for the weekend. His mother lived in a brownstone in Windsor Terrace, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to maintain boundaries. She'd been skeptical when he'd walked away from Morgan Stanley, even more skeptical when he'd started EC Venture in secret. But she'd supported him, because that's what you did for family, even when you thought they were making mistakes. "You look stressed," she said after Sophie had run upstairs to raid the candy stash she knew her grandmother kept for emergencies. "Big week." "The wedding." Not a question. He'd mentioned it last time he visited, mostly because his mother had pointed out that Sophie was talking about Victoria a lot, and Ethan should probably figure out whether this was serious before his daughter got too attached. "Victoria doesn't know who I am. Who I really am." The words came out flat, factual. His mother's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. "And you're planning to tell her when, exactly?" "I thought it would happen at the wedding. Ryan Mitchell, the groom, he's one of my investments. He'll recognize me. I figured I'd pull Victoria aside immediately after and explain before anyone else could interfere." His mother was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan braced himself for judgment he probably deserved. Instead, she asked, "Why tell her at all?" The question caught him off guard. "Because she deserves the truth." "She deserves the truth you decided to give her when you decided to give it." "That's not truth, Ethan. That's control." She poured herself tea, methodical and precise. "You're doing to her what Sarah did to you. Deciding what she can handle, when she can handle it, parceling out information on your terms instead of respecting her enough to let her make her own choices." The comparison felt like a slap, all the worse because it was accurate. Sarah had hidden her doubts for years, had let him believe their marriage was solid, while she quietly questioned whether she'd ever loved him at all. He'd sworn after her death that he'd never do that to someone else. And here he was, 3 days before a wedding, orchestrating a revelation instead of just being honest. "I was trying to protect what we have." "You were trying to protect yourself. There's a difference." Sophie bounded back downstairs then, interrupting the conversation, but her words stayed with him. That night, alone in his brownstone with too much time to think, Ethan acknowledged what he'd been avoiding for weeks. He'd been planning this reveal like a business transaction, calculating the optimal moment for maximum control and minimum damage. But relationships weren't business deals, and Victoria wasn't a founder pitching for funding. She was a person who'd trusted him with her vulnerability, and he'd responded by treating her like someone who needed to be managed. He picked up his phone one more time, opened Victoria's contact, and stared at the empty message field. His fingers moved across the keyboard, deleting and retyping and deleting again, trying to find words that would make this right. Finally, he sent, "Thank you for inviting me Saturday. It means more than you know." Her response came 3 minutes later. "Thank you for saying yes. I was terrified you'd think it was too much too soon." Another message followed immediately. "I'm glad you'll be there. I think I need you there." Ethan stared at those words until his vision blurred. She needed him there, and he was walking into that need, carrying a lie of omission that would shatter whatever fragile thing they'd built. He should have canceled. Should have called her right then and explained everything over the phone, given her the option to rescind the invitation and walk away clean. Should have done 100 things that required courage he couldn't find. Instead, he sent back, "I'll be there, I promise," and tried to believe that would be enough. Friday evening arrived with the weight of impending consequence. Victoria had texted that morning asking if Ethan wanted to join her family for dinner at the penthouse, something casual before the wedding chaos consumed the weekend. He'd agreed because saying no would have raised questions he couldn't answer without revealing everything, and because some masochistic part of him wanted to see the world Victoria inhabited when she wasn't hiding in Brooklyn cafes. The Hayes penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Fifth Avenue, the kind of address that didn't need a number because everyone who mattered already knew where it was. Ethan rode the private elevator up, watching the city shrink through glass walls, and tried to remember the last time he'd been in a space like this. Probably some investor dinner 3 years ago, back when he still occasionally accepted invitations he had no intention of enjoying. The elevator opened directly into the foyer, 14-foot ceilings, windows overlooking Central Park, the trees just starting to turn autumn colors. Furniture that looked uncomfortable and probably cost more than most people's cars, clean lines, minimal cushioning, the kind of aesthetic that prioritized appearance over function. Everything was white or black or steel gray, a monochrome declaration that this space belonged to people who didn't tolerate mess. Victoria met him at the door, and the relief on her face was immediate and visceral. She wore black pants and a cream sweater, simple and elegant, but her shoulders were tight with tension that suggested she'd been bracing for this evening, like someone preparing for surgery. "You came." "I said I would." She kissed his cheek, quick and nervous, then led him deeper into the penthouse. Diana Hayes waited in the living room, perched on a leather chair that looked more like sculpture than seating. She'd positioned herself to be backlit by the windows, a calculated choice that made her face harder to read while forcing visitors to squint against the glare. Ethan had seen the tactic before in boardrooms where executives used light as a weapon. Diana rose as they approached, extending a hand that was cool and dry and calculated the exact pressure that suggested breeding without warmth. She wore Ralph Lauren black, pearls at her throat, and an expression that could have frozen vodka. "Mr. Cole, Victoria tells me you work in investment consulting." The interrogation started before he'd fully crossed the threshold. Ethan shook her hand, held her gaze, and decided that honesty, partial honesty, the kind he'd been practicing for weeks, was the only defense that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. "I do, yes. Early-stage companies, mostly. Helping founders structure their growth." "How interesting. Which firm employs you?" "I'm independent. Prefer to work directly with clients rather than through institutional layers." Diana's smile never reached her eyes. "Independent? How modern. And where did you attend university?" "Penn. Wharton School of Business." That landed differently than she'd expected. Ethan saw the recalculation flicker across her features. Wharton meant credentials, meant he wasn't some nobody who'd wandered in off the street. She adjusted her approach accordingly, shifting from dismissive to merely skeptical. "And your family? Are they in finance as well?" Victoria cut in before Ethan could respond, her voice sharp with an edge he'd never heard before. "Mother, Ethan is my guest, not a job applicant. I'm simply getting to know the man my daughter brought to meet us. Surely that's acceptable." Diana turned back to Ethan without missing a beat. You mentioned you're a widower. I'm very sorry for your loss. Do you have children? A daughter, Sophie. She's 8. How lovely. And her mother? Died 4 years ago. Cancer. Diana's expression softened by perhaps half a degree, the calculation giving way to something that might have been genuine sympathy if you squinted. That must have been very difficult, raising a child alone while building a career. You do what you have to do. Natalie appeared from somewhere deeper in the penthouse, saving Ethan from further excavation. She was younger than Victoria by 3 years, softer in all the ways her sister had learned to harden, with a smile that seemed to cost her nothing. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater, clearly having dressed down from whatever she'd been doing earlier. You must be Ethan. I've heard so much about you. She pulled him into a hug that was immediate and genuine, the kind of unself-conscious warmth that suggested she hadn't yet learned to weaponize affection. Thank you for coming to the wedding. Victoria needs someone on her side who isn't going to spend the whole night asking when she's going to settle down. Natalie. Diana's voice carried a warning that her younger daughter completely ignored. What? It's true. You're going to corner every eligible man at the reception and point Victoria out like she's a rescue dog who needs adopting. Natalie grinned at Ethan, conspiratorial and kind. Fair warning. Mother's already compiled a list of suitable bachelors who'll be there tomorrow. Investment bankers, tech CEOs, a federal judge. All very accomplished, all very boring. Victoria's hand found Ethan's, squeezed once, hard. He squeezed back, a silent acknowledgement that they were both trapped in a performance neither had auditioned for. Dinner was catered. Some chef Diana had hired to prepare a meal that looked more like architecture than food. Tiny portions on oversized plates, everything arranged with geometric precision. Ethan ate mechanically while Diana continued her interrogation, questions aimed like scalpels looking for soft tissue. Where did he live? Brooklyn. Park Slope, a brownstone he'd bought after Sarah died. What kind of consulting exactly? Seed stage funding strategy, helping companies navigate their Series A rounds. Did he plan to expand his practice? Not particularly. He preferred working with a small number of clients he believed in. Each answer was true and incomplete, a mosaic of facts that added up to a picture just distorted enough to avoid the whole truth. Victoria watched him navigate her mother's examination with something like admiration, and Ethan felt the weight of her trust pressing against his sternum like a physical thing. The Ryan Mitchell problem sat in the corner of the room like unexploded ordnance. Nobody mentioned the Groom directly, but Natalie talked about NovaStream with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been hearing pitch decks at the dinner table for months. The company had just closed another funding round, was expanding into Europe, had been approached about acquisition by 3 different Fortune 500s. Ryan was brilliant and driven, and maybe worked too much, but wasn't that what you had to do when you were building something that mattered? Ethan made appropriate noises and kept his expression neutral, while his mind raced through probabilities. Ryan would be in California until tomorrow morning. Natalie had mentioned he was wrapping up meetings with potential partners in San Francisco, which meant tonight Ethan was safe, could get through this dinner without detonation, could maintain the fiction for one more evening. Except Diana had other plans. I wish Ryan could be here tonight. He's so busy with the business, though we should all be grateful that company is going to be worth billions eventually. She smiled at Ethan, all teeth and calculation. You work in early stage funding. Perhaps you've heard of NovaStream? Cloud security, Series C just closed at a $2.1 billion valuation. Ethan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Every instinct screamed at him to deflect, to claim ignorance, to change the subject before the ground beneath him crumbled completely. Instead, he heard himself offer the worst kind of truth, Acknowledgement without admission. I've heard of them. Impressive trajectory. Ryan's very proud of what he's built. Though he's the first to admit he had help in the early days. Some anonymous investor took a chance on him when everyone else passed. Diana's eyes locked onto Ethan with laser focus. He talks about it constantly. Says he owes everything to someone called EC Venture, though nobody seems to know who that is. The room went very still. Victoria's hand tightened on Ethan's under the table, and he couldn't tell if it was support or question. Natalie looked between them with dawning curiosity. Diana watched Ethan like a cat with a particularly interesting mouse, waiting to see which way he'd run. Anonymous investors are fairly common in early-stage funding. Lots of people prefer to work without publicity. How interesting that you'd know that. The trap was obvious and elegant, giving him just enough rope to hang himself. Ethan could feel the conversation spiraling toward revelation, could see the path from here to exposure in about 3 more exchanges. He should have shut it down, should have excused himself to the bathroom and texted Victoria that they needed to talk privately, immediately, before this went any further. Instead, his phone vibrated in his pocket, a lifeline disguised as interruption. He pulled it out, grateful for the excuse, and saw Sophie's name on the screen. His mother didn't call unless something was wrong. "I'm sorry, I need to take this. It's about my daughter." He stepped out onto the terrace before anyone could object, the November air sharp against his face after the climate-controlled perfection inside. His mother's voice was calm but urgent when he answered. "Sophie's fine, but she's running a fever. Nothing serious, probably just picked something up at school, but she's asking for you." Relief and concern warred in his chest. "I can be there in 40 minutes. She'll be asleep by then. I just wanted you to know. We've got it under control." "You sure?" "Ethan, I raised you through worse. We're fine." He hung up and stood on the terrace for a long moment, looking at the city spreading out below like scattered stars. Behind him, through the glass, he could see Victoria talking to her mother with animated gestures that suggested the interrogation had continued in his absence. This was his chance, the perfect excuse to leave early, to escape before Diana's questions peeled away any more layers. But leaving now would only delay the inevitable. Tomorrow at the wedding, Ryan would recognize him. The truth would come out in the worst possible way, in front of 300 people, and Victoria would realize he'd been given multiple opportunities to be honest and chosen evasion every time. He should go back inside and tell her now. Should ask Diana and Natalie to give them privacy. Should sit Victoria down and explain the whole thing. EC Venture, the investments, Ryan. The reason he'd been hiding in Brooklyn cafes for 4 years. Should give her the choice about whether to still bring him tomorrow or to face her family alone rather than attached to someone who'd been lying by omission since the day they met. The terrace door opened behind him. Victoria stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "Everything okay?" "Sophie's got a fever. Nothing serious, but she's not feeling great." "Do you need to go?" He should say yes. Should use this as the exit it was clearly meant to be. Instead, he shook his head. "My mom's with her. She'll be fine." Victoria moved closer, and Ethan could smell her perfume, something light and citrus that reminded him of summer even in November. "I'm sorry about Mother. She's a lot. She's protective, I get it. She's controlling. There's a difference." Victoria looked out at the city, her profile sharp against the lights. She does this thing where she makes you feel like you have to justify your entire existence before she'll consider you worthy of basic respect. I've watched her do it to every person I've brought home since high school. "How many people is that? Including you?" "3. She laughed, but the sound was hollow. "I learned early not to bother. Nobody ever measured up to her standards, and the ones who tried too hard to impress her ended up being exactly the kind of people I couldn't stand." Ethan thought about the suit recommendations, about price tags as a measure of worth, about how easy it would be to show up tomorrow in Tom Ford and a Rolex and watch Diana's entire perception shift. How that shift would feel like victory and betrayal in equal measure. Victoria, there's something I need to tell you. She turned to face him, and in the dim light from the penthouse, her eyes looked darker than usual, more vulnerable. About EC Venture? The question hit him like cold water. Ethan's mind raced through calculations, how much she knew, how much she'd guessed, whether this was the moment everything collapsed or the moment he finally chose honesty over control. What makes you think? I'm not stupid, Ethan. I saw that text from Ryan weeks ago. I looked you up. There's no Ethan Cole at Morgan Stanley in the records I could find. But there's an EC Venture that funded NovaStream and 13 other companies, all of which succeeded at rates that shouldn't be statistically possible. She crossed her arms, not defensive, but braced. The initials match. The timing matches. The way you talk about investment strategy like someone who's done it at the highest level matches. And you didn't say anything. I wanted you to tell me. I thought if it was true, if you really were this mysterious investor everyone's looking for, you'd trust me enough to be honest. The accusation landed soft, but devastating. Ethan felt the foundation beneath him finally give way completely. All his careful construction crumbling into rubble. She'd known for weeks, had been waiting for him to be brave enough to admit what she'd already figured out, and he'd failed that test repeatedly. I was going to tell you, I've been trying to find the right moment. There is no right moment, Ethan. There's just honesty or there isn't. Her voice stayed level, but he could hear the hurt underneath. I spent the last 3 weeks thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was so damaged by people who only wanted me for what I could give them that I was seeing deception where there wasn't any. You weren't wrong. Victoria nodded slowly, like he'd just confirmed a diagnosis she'd been dreading. So it's true. Your EC Venture. Yes. And Ryan, the man marrying my sister tomorrow, is one of your investments. Yes. Which means you knew exactly who would be at that wedding when I invited you. Knew Ryan would recognize you. Knew this whole thing would blow up in my face in front of my entire family. I thought I could control it. I thought if it happened, I'd pull you aside immediately, explain everything before anyone else could interfere. The words sounded weak even as he spoke them, excuses dressed up as strategy. I was trying to protect what we have. By lying to me. I never lied. Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Omission is lying, Ethan. You let me believe you were someone you're not. You let me bring you into my life, introduce you to my family, invite you to my sister's wedding, all while knowing you were carrying information that would change everything. I was scared. The admission came out raw, unpolished. I was scared that if you knew who I was, you'd stop seeing me and start seeing what I could do for you. It's happened before. It's the only thing that's ever happened. So you decided to test me, to see if I'd love you without knowing, to make me prove I was different before you'd risk being honest. Her voice cracked on the last word, fury and pain bleeding together. That's not protection, Ethan. That's manipulation. The word landed like a physical blow. Manipulation. The thing he'd sworn he'd never do after Sarah, after watching her shape their entire marriage around what she thought she needed from him rather than who she actually wanted. And here he was, doing the same thing with different tactics, controlling information to control outcome. You're right. Victoria blinked, clearly having expected argument. What? You're right. I was manipulating the situation. Telling myself it was about protecting you, protecting us. But really, it was about protecting myself. About making sure I didn't get hurt again. Ethan moved closer, close enough to see the tears she was fighting back. I'm sorry. I should have told you weeks ago.
Should have trusted you with the truth instead of making you earn it. Why didn't you? Because everyone who's ever known about EC Venture has wanted something from me. Investment, connections, access, money. Sarah married me thinking she loved me, and by the end, she wasn't sure whether she'd ever wanted me or just wanted the life I could provide. He swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. You were the first person in 4 years who looked at me and saw just Ethan, who wanted nothing except coffee and conversation. And I was terrified that if you knew the rest, that would change. So you made that choice for me, decided I couldn't handle knowing, decided you knew better than I did what I could be trusted with. Victoria shook her head, and a tear finally escaped, tracking down her cheek. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who think they know what's best for me. My father, who built a company and assumed I'd want to run it. My mother, who thinks a woman without a husband is somehow incomplete. Every board member who questions my decisions because I'm too young, or too female, or too emotional. She wiped the tear away with an angry gesture. I thought you were different. I thought you were someone who saw me as capable of making my own choices. But you're just like everyone else. You just hide it better. The comparison to Diana, to Christopher Hayes, to every person who'd ever tried to control Victoria's narrative, that was the killing blow. Ethan felt something essential crack in his chest, and he recognized it as the sound of consequence arriving exactly when earned. What do you want me to do? I want you to leave. Victoria, I mean it. I want you to go back to your brownstone and your daughter and your anonymous investing. I want you to leave me alone. I'm supposed to be at the wedding tomorrow. Consider the invitation rescinded. Her voice was pure ice now, the armor she wore in boardrooms slamming back into place. I'll tell my family you had a personal emergency. Nobody needs to know about any of this. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to fight for what they'd built in those morning hours at the turning page. But fighting would be another form of control, another way of deciding for her what she could handle. So instead, he nodded and walked toward the terrace door. He paused with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I meant everything I said to you. Every word that didn't involve money or business or EC Venture. Those parts were real. I know. That's what makes this worse. Inside the penthouse, Diana and Natalie looked up as Ethan crossed toward the elevator. He offered some excuse about Sophie being sick, about needing to get home, and Diana's expression suggested she didn't believe a word, but was too polite to call him a liar to his face. The elevator doors closed on the Hayes family tableau, Natalie looking concerned, Diana looking satisfied, and Victoria nowhere to be seen. The descent to street level took 30 seconds. 30 seconds to watch the city rise back up around him, to feel the weight of his own choices settling into his bones. He'd come to New York 8 years ago to prove he could build something that mattered without attaching his name to it. Had succeeded beyond any reasonable measure, turned nothing into a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. And in the process, he'd forgotten that invisibility was only valuable if you could take the mask off when it mattered.
Brooklyn welcomed him back with the familiar comfort of streets that didn't care who he was or what he'd done. His brownstone was dark except for the porch light he'd left on for himself, a small beacon in the November night. He sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the home he'd built for Sophie, thinking about the space Victoria would have occupied in it if he'd been brave enough to be honest. His phone buzzed. Not Victoria, he'd been foolish enough to hope for a moment, but his mother, checking that he'd gotten her message about Sophie. He texted back that he was home, that he'd pick Sophie up in the morning, that everything was fine. Everything was fine. He'd protected himself from the possibility of being used, and in doing so, he'd proven he was exactly the kind of person who deserved to be alone. The wedding was tomorrow. Ryan would stand at that altar having no idea that the ghost investor who'd saved his company had just been uninvited from his reception. Victoria would face her family alone, would field questions about where her date had gone, would probably make up some story about him being unreliable or flaky or not worth her time. Diana would be vindicated in her initial assessment, would spend the next year reminding Victoria that she'd been right to be skeptical. And Ethan would go back to the turning page on Tuesday morning and sit at his usual table, waiting for someone who would never return. He locked the truck and went inside, the brownstone cold and empty in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Tomorrow he'd pick up Sophie, would take her for pancakes and let her chatter about whatever 8-year-olds found important, would help her with homework and build her another bookshelf and pretend that his own life wasn't a monument to every wrong choice he'd ever made. The couch in the living room still held the indent where Victoria had sat 3 weeks ago, the first time she'd come to his home. Sophie had been at a sleepover, and they'd drunk wine and talked until 2 a.m. about nothing and everything. She'd fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder, and he'd stayed frozen in place for an hour, afraid to move and break the spell. He'd known then. Had known she was someone who mattered, someone worth the risk of honesty, and he'd chosen fear anyway. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, November asserting itself with the kind of weather that made you want to stay in bed. Ethan picked up Sophie from his mother's house, endured a look that said she knew something had gone wrong and was wise enough not to ask. Sophie was still pale from her fever, clingy in the way she got when she didn't feel well, and Ethan spent the morning on the couch with her, watching nature documentaries and making grilled cheese. Around 2 p.m., when the wedding would be starting, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, assumed it was another founder who'd tracked down his contact information. Then he saw the message preview, and his stomach dropped. Rachel Chen, Victoria's CFO, whose number he'd never had, but who'd apparently found his anyway. The message was short and devastating. She's at the wedding, alone, looking miserable. I don't know what happened between you two, but if you care about her at all, you should be there. Ethan stared at the message for a long time. Victoria had told him to leave her alone, had made her position clear. Showing up now would be violating her explicit wishes, would be another form of control disguised as concern. But Rachel's message suggested Victoria was suffering, was facing her family alone after all, dealing with whatever questions and judgments that entailed. And Ethan had put her in that position by being a coward. Sophie looked up from the TV, reading his face with the uncanny accuracy of children who knew their parents too well. Is that about Victoria? Yeah. Are you in trouble? I'm in trouble. Did you tell her the truth? Not until it was too late. Sophie considered this with the gravity of a federal judge weighing evidence. Then she picked up the remote and paused David Attenborough mid-sentence about penguins. Daddy, remember what you told me last year when I lied to you about breaking your coffee mug? That lying makes things worse even when you're scared. And remember what you said I had to do? Tell the truth and deal with the consequences. So why aren't you doing that? The logic was unassailable. Ethan looked at his 8-year-old daughter, at the fever-flushed face and serious eyes, and recognized that he taught her better than he'd managed to practice himself. His phone buzzed again, another text from Rachel. The plaza. She's in the ballroom. If you hurry, you might make it before dinner. Grandma can come stay with you. You'll be okay for a few hours? Sophie nodded, already reaching for the phone to call her grandmother herself. Go fix it, Daddy. I don't know if I can. You won't know until you try. 40 minutes later, Ethan stood outside the plaza in his gray Brooks Brothers suit, the same one he'd worn to Morgan Stanley meetings a decade ago. It still fit, though the shoulders felt tighter than he remembered. He'd shaved, combed his hair, done everything he could to look presentable for a black tie wedding he'd been explicitly uninvited from. The doorman looked at him skeptically. Can I help you, sir? I'm here for the Hayes Mitchell wedding. Are you on the guest list? I was, then I wasn't. Now I'm hoping to fix that. Ethan met the man's eyes, saw the calculation happening behind them. Look, I made a mistake, a big one, and the woman I care about is in there dealing with consequences that should be mine. I'm not asking to stay for the reception. I just need 5 minutes to apologize. The doorman studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Sterling Ballroom, 3rd floor. Security might stop you. Thank you. The ballroom doors were closed when Ethan arrived, muffled sounds of ceremony filtering through. He could hear the officiant's voice, distant and formal, conducting the ritual of commitment. His hand touched the door handle, and he froze. This was it. The moment where everything either shattered completely or had a chance of healing. If he walked in now, Ryan would see him, would recognize him immediately. The revelation Ethan had been trying to control would happen exactly as he'd feared, publicly, dramatically, in front of everyone who mattered to Victoria. He could still walk away, could text Victoria later, could try to explain through the safety of distance, could give her space to process without adding the humiliation of a scene. But walking away was what had caused this mess in the first place. Walking away was what he'd been doing for 4 years, hiding in anonymity and calling it healing. Ethan opened the door and stepped inside. The ballroom swallowed sound like a cathedral. 300 guests arranged in neat rows, facing an altar, drowning in white roses from California. Ethan slipped through the door and pressed himself against the back wall, trying to make his 6-foot frame invisible in a room where everyone had paid attention to who belonged. A few heads turned, curiosity flickering across faces, before dismissing him as staff or a lost tourist who'd wandered into the wrong event. Victoria sat in the 3rd row, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She wore the navy dress he'd watched her choose 2 weeks ago when they'd gone shopping in Soho. She tried on 6 different options and kept coming back to this one because it felt like armor that didn't announce itself. Even from across the room, Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself against the world. At the altar, Ryan Mitchell stood beside Natalie in his Tom Ford tuxedo, face glowing with the kind of happiness that came from believing everything in your life had finally aligned. The officiant droned through vows, words about love and commitment and choosing each other every day. Standard wedding liturgy, beautiful and meaningless until you were the one saying it. Ethan's plan, such as it was, involved waiting until after the ceremony, catching Victoria before the reception, pulling her aside for the conversation they should have had weeks ago. Controlled revelation, minimal damage, a chance to explain before chaos consumed everything. The officiant smiled. "You may now kiss the bride." Ryan leaned toward Natalie, and Ethan saw the exact moment everything derailed. Ryan's eyes drifted past his bride's face, scanning the crowd with the automatic reflex of someone who'd spent years working rooms and remembering faces. His gaze landed on Ethan and stopped. Color drained from Ryan's face like someone had opened a valve. His lips hovered an inch from Natalie's, frozen mid-motion, and the entire ballroom felt the wrongness of it. Natalie's smile faltered. The officiant shifted uncomfortably. 300 people held their breath, waiting for the kiss that should have already happened. Ryan released Natalie's hands and turned away from her completely. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion spreading like contagion. He walked down the altar steps with purpose, past the front row where Diana Hayes sat rigid with shock, past the bridesmaids exchanging panicked glances, walked straight toward Ethan with the inevitability of gravity. Ethan's throat closed. This wasn't controlled. This wasn't managed. This was detonation in real time, and he could do nothing but stand there and let it happen. Ryan stopped 3 feet away, and up close, Ethan could see tears forming in the younger man's eyes. Recognition and gratitude, and something like awe, all tangled together in an expression that would have been touching if it wasn't currently destroying a wedding ceremony. "Mr. Cole, sir." The ballroom went absolutely silent. Victoria turned in her seat, and Ethan watched, understanding, crash across her face like a wave. She'd known he was E.C. Venture. She hadn't known Ryan would do this. Ryan's voice shook. "I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't... God, I'm sorry, I just..." He took a breath, steadied himself, and when he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of the room. 3 years ago, this man saved my company. When every investor in New York had turned me down, when I was about to lose my house and my savings and everything I'd built, he gave me a chance. He believed in me when nobody else would. Phones materialized in hands throughout the ballroom. Diana Hayes stood, one hand pressed to her chest. Natalie remained frozen at the altar, bouquet dangling forgotten at her side. Ryan turned to address the crowd, and Ethan realized with sinking dread that the younger man was about to make this even worse. "This is Ethan Cole, E.C. Venture, the anonymous investor who's funded half the unicorns in this city. The man who turns unknowns into empires and never asks for credit." The murmurs became a roar. People stood for better views. A woman in the 4th row actually gasped loud enough to hear. Ethan caught fragments of conversation. "I've been trying to find him for years," and "Do you know how much he's worth?" and "Someone get his contact information." Victoria's eyes locked onto his across the crowded room, and what Ethan saw there wasn't anger or betrayal. It was something far worse. Resignation. The look of someone who'd hoped to be wrong and just had their worst assumptions confirmed. "Victoria, The words died in his throat, because what could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry I let you bring me here knowing this would happen. I'm sorry I've been exactly who you were afraid I was." She stood without a word and walked toward the exit, moving fast enough that people had to scramble out of her way. Natalie called after her from the altar, voice tight with confusion and hurt. Diana started after her daughter, but stopped when Victoria held up one hand in a gesture that clearly meant, "Stay back." Ethan pushed through the crowd, ignoring Ryan's attempt to apologize, ignoring Diana's sharp, "Mr. Cole, we should talk," ignoring every single person who tried to intercept him with business cards and pitches. He caught up to Victoria on the terrace outside the ballroom, the same kind of terrace where they'd stood last night, where he'd almost told her everything and chosen cowardice instead. She gripped the railing hard enough that her knuckles went white. Manhattan spread out below them, indifferent and vast. "You came anyway." "I came to apologize, to tell you everything before—" He gestured helplessly toward the ballroom. "Before that." "Before my sister's wedding became a networking event for people who want access to EC Venture." Her voice was flat, scraped clean of emotion. "Before my family learned that I brought the most sought-after investor in New York to a social function and didn't even know who he was. I never meant for this to happen." Victoria laughed, and the sound could have stripped paint. "What did you think would happen, Ethan? You knew Ryan was the groom. You knew he'd recognize you. You came here planning exactly this." "I came here planning to tell you first, to pull you aside the second Ryan reacted and explain everything before anyone else could interfere. I thought I could control it." "There's that word again. Control." She turned to face him fully, and Ethan saw tears tracking down her face despite her rigid composure. "You've been controlling this entire relationship from the start. When I learned your real identity, how I learned it, making sure you could manage my reaction, manage the fallout, manage me." "That's not fair, isn't it?" Victoria's voice rose, years of frustration finally finding release. "You researched me. You knew who I was the second I walked into that cafe, but you let me think we were both just strangers looking for quiet. You let me believe we were building something equal when you'd already decided what information I deserved and when I deserved it." Ethan felt his own anger rising to meet hers, defensive and sharp. "You want to talk about control? You investigated me too. You saw Ryan's text and went looking for answers online. You've suspected for weeks and never said anything. How is that different?" "Because I was trying to understand, not manipulate."
I was giving you space to tell me the truth on your own terms. I was hoping you'd trust me enough to be honest without me having to corner you. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "I didn't use my sister's wedding as a stage for some grand reveal. I didn't decide that this," she gestured at the chaos visible through the ballroom windows, "was an acceptable way for the truth to come out." The accusation landed like it was meant to, cutting straight to the bone. Ethan had been so focused on protecting himself, on making sure Victoria learned about EC Venture in a way that let him maintain some semblance of control, that he'd never stopped to consider what she needed, what she deserved. "You're right." Victoria blinked, clearly having expected more argument. "What?" "You're right. About all of it. I knew Ryan would be here. I knew this could happen. And I came anyway because I was more concerned with managing how you found out than with just being honest." He moved closer, close enough to see the exact moment her anger cracked to reveal the hurt underneath. "I told myself I was protecting what we had, that if I could control the circumstances, you wouldn't hate me for keeping secrets. How's that working out for you?" "Spectacularly badly." Ethan scrubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. "My wife spent our entire marriage lying to me about whether she actually loved me or just loved what I could provide. She died before we could untangle which parts were real.
and I swore I'd never let someone use me like that again. So you decided to use me instead. The words hit like a physical blow, all the worse because they were accurate. Ethan had spent 4 years building walls to protect himself from being exploited, and in the process, he'd become the exploiter, had taken Victoria's vulnerability and returned it with calculation. I didn't mean to, but yes, that's what I did.
He forced himself to hold her gaze, to not look away from the pain he'd caused.
I treated you like a risk to be managed, instead of a person worthy of honesty. And I'm sorry. That's inadequate and insufficient, but it's true. Victoria wiped her eyes with an angry gesture, smearing mascara across her cheek. Do you have any idea what it's like inside that ballroom right now? My mother is probably already compiling a list of ways to leverage your presence for business connections. Natalie's wedding, the day that's supposed to be about her, is now about the mysterious EC venture finally showing his face. And everyone's going to assume I knew, that I brought you here deliberately to make some kind of statement. I'll go back in and tell them. I'll explain that you had no idea, that this was entirely my failure. That'll make it worse. Then everyone knows I was dating someone for weeks without figuring out who he really was. Either I'm complicit or I'm an idiot. There's no third option. She laughed again, bitter and raw. God, my mother must be thrilled. She's been telling me for years that I'm too trusting, too naive about people's motivations. This is every I told you so she's ever wanted to deliver. Inside the ballroom, someone had apparently convinced the wedding party to continue. Music started playing, the officiant's voice rising in a determined attempt to salvage the ceremony. Through the glass, Ethan could see Ryan and Natalie standing at the altar again, though Natalie kept glancing toward the terrace with obvious concern. Diana Hayes appeared at the ballroom doors, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who decided enough was enough. She stepped onto the terrace without asking permission, her expression a careful mask of professional courtesy that didn't quite hide the calculation underneath. Mr. Cole, I believe we were interrupted last night. She extended her hand, and this time when Ethan shook it, the pressure was different, warmer, more interested. Had I known who you were, I would have been considerably more welcoming. I preferred being unknown. Clearly, though I have to say it's quite a coincidence that you'd choose my daughter to reveal yourself to. Hayes Technologies has been looking for strategic investors for our European expansion. Your expertise in scaling international operations would be invaluable. Victoria's voice cut through her mother's pitch like a blade. Mother, stop. I'm simply pointing out opportunities. You're proving exactly why he didn't tell anyone who he was. Because people like you can't see past what they want to take. Victoria moved between Ethan and Diana, a human shield against exploitation. He's not here for business. He's not interested in your board seat or your expansion or whatever other schemes you're already planning. Diana's expression cooled by several degrees. Victoria, you're being dramatic. I'm being honest. Something you might try sometime. Don't speak to me that way, especially not in front of guests. He's not a guest. He was my guest until he wasn't, and now he's leaving. Victoria turned to Ethan, and her face was a war between fury and something that looked dangerously close to grief. We're done. Whatever we had, whatever I thought we had, it's over. I can't be with someone who thinks managing me is the same as trusting me. The finality in her voice left no room for argument. Ethan wanted to fight anyway, wanted to explain that he could change, could learn to be honest even when it scared him. But fighting would just be another form of control, another way of deciding for her what she should feel. I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you do. I think you understand that you got caught, that your careful plan fell apart. But I don't think you actually understand what you did wrong. Victoria's voice shook, but she kept going. You didn't just lie by omission. You robbed me of agency. You decided I couldn't handle knowing the truth, decided you knew better than me what I needed, decided to control the narrative until it blew up in both our faces. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to, carving away at the justifications Ethan had built for himself. He told himself he was being careful, being strategic, being protective, had never once considered that protection without consent was just another word for control. You're right. I did all of that. And I can't undo it. He looked past Victoria to where Diana stood watching with the intensity of someone cataloging ammunition for future use. But I can make sure it doesn't get worse. I'll tell everyone inside that you had no idea who I was, that I deliberately kept it from you, that you deserve better than someone who treats honesty like a negotiation tactic. That won't fix anything. I know, but it might make the next few hours slightly less unbearable. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Ethan saw the exact instant she made her decision. Whatever future they might have had, coffee on Tuesday mornings, dinner with Sophie, the slow building of something real, all of it dissolved in the November air. Goodbye, Ethan. She walked back into the ballroom without looking back. Diana followed after a moment, but not before giving Ethan a business card that he didn't ask for and wouldn't use. He stood alone on the terrace while the ceremony concluded inside, while Ryan and Natalie finally kissed to enthusiastic applause, while 300 people who'd come for a wedding got a networking opportunity instead. He could go back in, could do what he'd promised and explain to the crowd that Victoria had been as blindsided as everyone else, could try to salvage her reputation even if their relationship was beyond saving. But walking back into that ballroom meant facing Ryan's gratitude and Diana's calculation, and the 100 other ways people would want to use him now that his invisibility was shattered. Meant answering questions and deflecting pitches and being EC Venture instead of just Ethan. He'd spent 4 years hiding from exactly this, and now it had found him anyway. Ethan left through a side exit, nodding to the same doorman who'd let him in. The man gave him a look that suggested he'd seen this exact kind of disaster play out before and knew better than to comment. Outside, November had turned colder, the kind of weather that made you want to go home and stay there. His truck was still in Brooklyn, so Ethan walked down Fifth Avenue past boutiques and hotels and restaurants where people ate meals that cost more than most families spent on groceries. Walked until the neighborhoods changed, until glass towers gave way to brownstones, until he could breathe without feeling Manhattan pressing down on him from all sides. His phone buzzed constantly, text messages from numbers he didn't recognize, LinkedIn notifications, emails from founders who'd somehow tracked down his contact information in the 30 minutes since Ryan had outed him. He turned the phone off completely and kept walking. By the time he reached Park Slope, the sun was setting and his feet ached. The brownstone looked exactly as he'd left it, porch light on, Sophie's bicycle on the lawn, the carefully constructed life of a single father who'd thought anonymity was the same as safety. His mother's car sat in the driveway, which meant she'd brought Sophie home and was probably inside making dinner and wondering what had happened. Ethan let himself in quietly, hoping to slip upstairs and compose himself before facing questions. No such luck. Sophie appeared in the hallway immediately, still pale from her fever but upright and moving. Did you fix it? No, sweetheart, I didn't. Is she still mad? Very mad. And she has good reason to be. Sophie processed this with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice weighing precedent. Are you going to give up? She asked me to leave her alone. So, yes. That's not what I asked. Sophie crossed her arms, a gesture she'd picked up from her grandmother and deployed with devastating effectiveness. I asked if you're going to give up. Because giving up is different than respecting someone's space. Ethan's mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel and looking at her son with the expression that had terrified him as a child. Sophie, go wash your hands for dinner. Your father and I need to talk. Sophie went, but not before shooting Ethan a look that clearly said, this conversation isn't over. His mother gestured toward the living room, and Ethan followed like a man walking to his own execution. They sat in silence for a moment, his mother studying him with the same intensity she'd used to extract confessions when he was 12 and had broken the neighbor's window with a baseball. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was gentle in a way that somehow made it worse. You did to her what Sarah did to you. The comparison, the same one Victoria had made, landed like a hammer. I know. Do you? Because knowing and understanding are different things, Ethan. Sarah spent years hiding her doubts from you, making decisions about your marriage without giving you a voice in those decisions. She controlled the narrative until she couldn't anymore. And then she dropped the truth on you when you had no defenses left. I wasn't trying to hurt Victoria. Sarah probably wasn't trying to hurt you either. But impact matters more than intention. His mother leaned forward, and he could see the concern etched into the lines around her eyes. You've spent 4 years so terrified of being used that you've forgotten how to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is the only foundation that real relationships can be built on. I was vulnerable with her. I told her about you, about Sophie. You told her carefully curated facts that made you look sympathetic without revealing anything that might threaten your control. That's not vulnerability, Ethan. That's public relations. The accuracy of it stung worse than accusation. Ethan had believed he was being honest in those morning conversations at the turning page, had felt exposed when he talked about Sarah's death and Sophie's questions and the weight of single parenthood. But he'd never once risked the thing that actually mattered, his identity as EC Venture, the secret that would let Victoria see him completely. I don't know how to fix this. I don't think you can, not immediately. His mother stood, heading back toward the kitchen. But you can start by figuring out why you did it, what you were actually protecting yourself from. Because until you understand that, you're just going to keep making the same mistakes with different people. She left him alone with that question, and Ethan sat in his living room while the sun finished setting and tried to trace the architecture of his own fear. It wasn't just Sarah's deathbed confession, though that had certainly calcified things. It went deeper, back to the early days at Morgan Stanley when senior partners had befriended him only to steal his clients. Back to college roommates who'd wanted help with their business plans and disappeared once they'd extracted what they needed. Back to a childhood spent being the smart kid that other children only approached when they needed homework help. Somewhere along the way, he'd learned that his value lay in what he could provide, not who he was. And he'd spent his entire adult life trying to prove that wasn't true by hiding everything that made him valuable. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't currently destroying his life. Sophie came back after dinner, climbing onto the couch beside him with the kind of determined affection that suggested she'd decided he needed comfort, whether he asked for it or not. They sat in silence for a while, her small warmth pressed against his side, before she spoke. My teacher says that when you make a mistake, You have to make it right, even if the other person doesn't forgive you. Because making it right isn't about them forgiving you. It's about you being the kind of person who makes things right. Your teacher sounds very wise. She is. She's also really good at knowing when people are lying. Sophie tilted her head back to look at him. Victoria probably won't forgive you right away. Maybe not ever. But you should still try to make it right.
How do I do that? I don't know. You're the grown-up. You're supposed to figure that stuff out. Fair enough.
Ethan pulled his daughter closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. When did you get so smart? I've always been smart. You just haven't always been listening. The weekend passed in a fog of obligation and avoidance. Ethan kept his phone off, ignored the inevitable flood of messages and emails and requests. He took Sophie to her favorite diner for pancakes, helped her with a school project about the solar system, built her a model of Jupiter's moons out of styrofoam balls and wire. Normal father-daughter routines that felt hollow without the future he'd been imagining. Victoria joining them for breakfast, helping Sophie with homework, becoming part of the careful life he'd constructed. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. Ethan couldn't avoid the phone forever.
His portfolio companies needed oversight. Founders needed guidance. And someone had to deal with the fact that EC Ventures' anonymity was now completely shattered. He powered the phone on and watched notifications flood in. 87 emails, 43 text messages, 12 voicemails, requests for interviews, investment pitches, congratulations from people he'd funded years ago who were thrilled to finally put a face to the name. A message from Ryan Mitchell apologizing profusely for the scene at the wedding, begging for a chance to explain in person. And one email from Rachel Chen, Victoria's CFO, with a subject line that simply read, "She's stepping down." Ethan's stomach dropped. He opened the email with shaking hands. Rachel's message was brief and professional. Victoria had announced to the Hayes Technologies board that she was transitioning to an advisory role, effective immediately. Rachel would take over as CEO, while Victoria pursued other interests. The board had been shocked, but supportive. Diana Hayes had threatened to fight the decision, but ultimately accepted it when Victoria made clear she'd resign entirely if pushed. The email ended with a single line. "She's doing what she should have done years ago. I thought you'd want to know." Ethan stared at the scream, trying to process implications. Victoria had been talking for weeks about feeling trapped by her father's legacy, about wanting to pursue architecture instead of enterprise software. But she'd always framed it as impossible, something she'd given up too long ago to reclaim. Now she was reclaiming it, making a choice that would shock her family and confuse her board and probably trigger a dozen different crises. And she was doing it alone, without support, because the person she'd trusted enough to share her dreams with had betrayed that trust. He could reach out, could send a message congratulating her, telling her he was proud of her courage, could try to be the friend she'd needed, even if he couldn't be the partner she'd wanted. But reaching out would be inserting himself back into her life after she'd explicitly asked him to leave, would be another form of control, another way of deciding what she needed rather than respecting what she'd asked for. Ethan closed the email and opened the next one, then the next. Worked his way through the backlog of messages, responding to founders and declining interviews, and trying to figure out how to be EC Venture now that the veil had been torn away. Tuesday morning came with the weight of broken routine. 7:30 found Ethan sitting in his kitchen with coffee, trying to talk himself out of the thing he desperately wanted to do. The turning page would be open. His corner table would be available. He could go sit there like he had for months, could occupy that space,
and hope Victoria might show up, even though she'd made it clear they were done. That was exactly the kind of boundary violation his mother had warned him about. Exactly the kind of selfish hope that prioritized his needs over Victoria's explicit wishes. He stayed home. Wednesday was worse. Thursday worse still. The cafe had become such an ingrained part of his routine that avoiding it felt like deliberately skipping meals. By Friday, Ethan was desperate enough to walk past the turning page just to see if Victoria might be visible through the window. She wasn't. Mrs. Chen was behind the counter. The college student was typing near the window. The old man with his newspaper occupied the table by the register. But Victoria's chair sat empty, and Ethan knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't coming back. He'd ruined this, too. Had taken the one place that felt safe to both of them and turned it into another casualty of his own fear. The following Tuesday, Ethan showed up at the turning page at 7:30 with no plan beyond occupying the space they'd shared and hoping muscle memory might tell him what to do next. Mrs. Chen looked up when he entered, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Ethan, haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy. Sophie had a fever, then work got complicated." "The young lady with the laptop hasn't been in either. I was worried something happened." Ethan ordered his usual coffee and sat at his usual table, pulling out a book he had no intention of reading. The cafe felt different without Victoria's presence. Emptier, colder, just a place instead of a sanctuary. He stayed for 2 hours, watching the door, feeling pathetic and desperate and unable to stop himself. She didn't come. Thursday was the same, and the Tuesday after that. 3 weeks of showing up to an empty table, drinking coffee that had gone cold, pretending to read while actually just staring at the door. Mrs. Chen stopped asking questions after the first week, started just bringing his coffee without comment, and leaving him to his vigil. On the 4th Thursday, Rachel Chen walked through the door. She spotted Ethan immediately, crossed to his table without asking permission, and sat down in Victoria's chair. Up close, she looked exhausted, the kind of tired that came from carrying someone else's workload on top of your own. "She won't come back here. You know that, right?" Ethan closed his book. "I know." "So why do you keep showing up?" "Because I don't know what else to do." Rachel signaled Mrs. Chen for coffee, waited until it arrived, and the older woman had retreated to a respectful distance. Then she leaned forward, and her voice was low and intense. "Do you know what Victoria said when she told me about you? Not after the wedding. Before. Back when she first started suspecting you might be EC Venture." Rachel didn't wait for an answer. She said she hoped she was wrong. Because if you were this famous investor hiding in coffee shops, then everything she thought you had together was probably built on lies. It wasn't, let me finish. She said that if you were EC Venture and you hadn't told her, it meant you didn't trust her, that you saw her as someone to be managed rather than someone to be honest with, and she said that would break her heart because she'd spent her whole life surrounded by people who managed her instead of seeing her. The words landed like body blows, each one accurate and devastating. Ethan had no defense because there was no defense to offer. She was right. I know she was right. That's why I'm here. Because you need to understand what you did. Rachel wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and Ethan noticed they were shaking slightly. Victoria spent 6 years running a company she never wanted to run because her father died and someone had to step up. She spent those 6 years being told she was too young, too emotional, too female, too everything. And she proved them all wrong by being smarter and tougher and more strategic than any of the men who doubted her. I know you don't know. You don't know what it cost her. The relationships she didn't pursue because she couldn't risk people thinking she got her position through anything other than merit. The dreams she set aside because there wasn't time or energy for both. The way she learned to make herself smaller and harder and lonelier just to survive in rooms full of men who thought they deserved her job more than she did. Rachel's voice cracked, and she took a moment to compose herself. And then she found you. This guy in a coffee shop who saw her as just Victoria, not Hayes Technologies' CEO, not Christopher Hayes' daughter, just a woman who was tired and lonely and desperate for someone to see past the armor. She let herself hope that maybe she'd finally found someone who wanted her for her. I did want her for her. But you didn't trust her with you. You didn't give her the same honesty she gave you. You treated her like another business deal to be managed, another risk to be calculated. Rachel stood, and her expression was pure steel. She stepped down from Hayes Technologies because you showed her it was possible to choose yourself over other people's expectations, to walk away from what you're supposed to want and chase what you actually need. So congratulations, Ethan. You taught her the most important lesson of her life. And then you lost her. She left before he could respond, the door chiming behind her with cheerful indifference. Ethan sat alone in the cafe while morning traffic picked up outside, while Mrs. Chen served other customers, while the world continued its rotation, completely unconcerned with his personal devastation. Rachel was right. He'd shown Victoria that change was possible, while simultaneously proving he wasn't brave enough to change himself. Had encouraged her dreams while hiding behind his own fear. The hypocrisy was staggering. His phone buzzed, a text from Sophie's school about an upcoming parent-teacher conference. Normal life, continuing despite emotional catastrophe. Ethan responded that he'd be there, then scrolled through the rest of his messages. More interview requests, more pitches, an email from a Bloomberg reporter offering 6 figures for an exclusive profile. And buried at the bottom, an email from Diana Hayes' assistant requesting a meeting to discuss strategic investment opportunities. Ethan deleted it without reading past the subject line. He'd told Diana at the wedding he wasn't interested in her board seat or her expansion or any other scheme she was planning. Apparently, she'd decided his refusal was just an opening negotiation rather than a firm no. The email reappeared 2 days later, then again a week after that. Diana Hayes was nothing if not persistent, a quality that had probably served her well in business and made her exhausting in every other context. The 4th time, Ethan finally responded with a single line, "Not interested. Please don't contact me again." Her response came within minutes. "We should discuss this in person. I have information about Victoria that you'll want to hear." The manipulation was transparent and effective. Ethan knew he shouldn't take the bait, knew Diana was playing him exactly the way he'd played Victoria. But the thought that she might have information, that Victoria might be struggling in ways he didn't know about, might need help she was too proud to ask for. That was enough to override his better judgment. He agreed to lunch at a restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where deals were made and privacy was guaranteed through exorbitant prices and strategic table spacing. Diana arrived exactly on time, dressed in black Chanel with pearls that probably cost more than his truck, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never doubting you deserved to be in any room you entered. "Thank you for meeting me. You said you had information about Victoria." Diana smiled, and it was all calculation. "I do. She's making a terrible mistake with this architecture venture, throwing away everything Christopher built so she can play at designing sustainable housing for people who can't afford to pay her what she's worth." That sounds like exactly the kind of thing she should be doing. It's financial suicide. She's already lost 2 potential clients because they think she's not serious, that she's just a rich woman playing at having a career. Diana sipped her water with deliberate precision. She needs guidance. Someone with business acumen to help her structure the venture properly. Someone like you. The pitch landed exactly as Diana had intended it, appealing to Ethan's protective instincts while offering him a path back into Victoria's life. He could reach out under the guise of business advice, could position himself as a resource rather than a romantic interest, could slowly rebuild trust while helping her avoid catastrophic mistakes. It was manipulation dressed up as concern, and Ethan recognized it because he'd used the same tactics himself. No. Diana's expression flickered with surprise. I'm offering you exactly what you want. A way back into her life that doesn't require you to grovel or apologize. A professional relationship that could develop into something more once she's forgiven you. I don't want a professional relationship. I don't want to trick my way back into her trust. And I especially don't want to do it at your direction while you pull strings from behind the curtain. Ethan stood, leaving his water untouched. Victoria asked me to leave her alone, so I'm going to respect that even though it kills me. Because that's what you do when you actually care about someone. You give them what they need, not what you want them to need. He left Diana sitting alone at the table, probably already calculating her next move. Outside, Manhattan was having one of its rare, perfect days. Clear sky, mild temperature, the kind of weather that made you remember why people tolerated the noise and crowds and expense. Ethan walked back to where he'd parked his truck, feeling something shift in his chest. For weeks, he'd been focused on fixing what he'd broken, on finding a way back to Victoria that would let him undo his mistakes. But Rachel was right. Victoria had made her choice, had walked away from him and from Hayes Technologies and toward the life she'd always wanted. And the most loving thing Ethan could do was let her go, even if it meant spending the rest of his life wondering what they could have been. 6 months crawled past with the agonizing slowness of consequence. Ethan reduced EC Ventures' activity to 3 investments a year, turned down everything else, and focused on being Sophie's father instead of New York's ghost investor. He showed up for parent-teacher conferences and helped with science projects, and built her an elaborate tree house in the backyard that took 2 months and made his hands bleed. Sophie asked about Victoria exactly once, about 3 months after the wedding. They were working on the tree house, Ethan holding boards while Sophie painted them her favorite shade of purple, when she looked up with those 2 knowing eyes and asked if Victoria was ever coming back. No, sweetheart, she's not. Because you messed up? Because I messed up, and she deserves better than someone who treats honesty like a negotiation. Sophie had nodded and gone back to painting, and Ethan loved her fiercely for not pushing, for understanding that some wounds needed time to scar over before you could examine them. The turning page became just a cafe again, a place where he occasionally grabbed coffee but never lingered. Mrs. Chen had asked about the young woman with the laptop one more time about a month after Rachel's visit, and Ethan had told her the truth. They'd had a falling out, and it was his fault, and he was working on being the kind of person who didn't make the same mistakes twice. Mrs. Chen had patted his hand and said she hoped he figured it out, and that was the end of it. In April, Ethan accepted an interview request from Forbes. Not because he wanted publicity, he'd never wanted publicity, but because he'd realized that invisibility had been another form of control. By hiding EC Ventures' identity, he'd maintained power over how people perceived him, what they knew about him, whether they could access him. The same control he'd used to disastrous effect with Victoria. The interview took place at the Turning Page, Ethan's choice, in the corner where he'd first talked to a tired woman who'd asked if silence could be louder than noise. The journalist was young and intense, armed with questions about investment strategy and portfolio construction and the future of venture capital. Ethan answered honestly about his process, how he invested in people more than ideas, how he looked for founders who'd keep building even if he said no, how success meant creating sustainable businesses rather than quick exits. And when the journalist asked why he'd stayed anonymous for so long, Ethan gave the answer he'd spent 6 months learning. Because I was afraid.
Afraid of being used, afraid of losing control, afraid of letting people see me completely and having them decide I wasn't worth knowing. So I hid behind anonymity and told myself it was about staying humble. But really, it was just another way of being dishonest. The article published 3 weeks later with the headline, E.C. Venture Breaks His Silence. It was fair and thoughtful, focusing on Ethan's investment philosophy and his decision to step into visibility. The last paragraph mentioned his daughter and his Brooklyn brownstone and his commitment to building things that lasted. Ethan read it once, sent a copy to his mother, and moved on. Summer arrived with Sophie's 9th birthday and all the chaos that entailed. 15 kids in the backyard, a cake decorated with a solar system, games that involved far too much screaming for one adult to manage alone.
Ethan's mother came to help wrangle children, and even Rachel showed up with a present and a carefully neutral expression that suggested she was here for Sophie and definitely not sending any messages on Victoria's behalf. Except she absolutely was, because halfway through the party, she pulled Ethan aside and said 5 words that cracked his carefully constructed equilibrium. "She's doing really well, you know." Ethan didn't ask who. "Good, that's good." "Hayes Architecture just landed a contract with the city for affordable housing design. It's all over the architecture blogs. Victoria's been quoted in the Times talking about sustainable building practices and community-centered development." Rachel paused, watching his face for reaction. "She seems happy, freer than I've ever seen her." The words should have hurt, should have triggered all the regret and loss Ethan had been carefully managing for 6 months. Instead, he felt something unexpected, genuine happiness.
Victoria was building the life she'd always wanted, the one she'd been too afraid or too obligated to pursue. She was free.
"Thank you for telling me." Rachel studied him for a long moment. "You're not going to reach out to her, are you?"
No. She asked me to leave her alone. I'm going to respect that.
"Even though you're still in love with her?" Ethan looked across the yard to where Sophie was explaining the difference between asteroids and comets to 3 fascinated 8-year-olds. His daughter, brilliant, kind, perceptive beyond her years, who'd learned about honesty and courage by watching him fail at both. Who deserved a father who'd figured out that loving someone meant respecting their choices, even when those choices excluded you. Especially because I'm still in love with her. Rachel's expression softened. She'd probably appreciate knowing that. Eventually, when she's ready.
Maybe. But that's her timeline to decide, not mine. The party wound down as evening approached, parents collecting tired children and half-eaten cake slices. Sophie crashed on the couch by 8, exhausted and happy, surrounded by presents she'd barely had time to unwrap. Ethan sat beside her while she drifted off, and for the first time in months, he felt something approaching peace. He'd made mistakes, had hurt someone he cared about through his own fear and need for control. But he was learning, slowly, painfully, through consequence and reflection, and the steady wisdom of an 8-year-old who understood that being brave meant doing hard things, even when they scared you. Victoria was building her life. He was building his. And maybe someday,
those lives would intersect again, when enough time had passed and enough growth had happened that they could look at each other without the weight of betrayal making everything impossible. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe this was it, a connection that had burned bright and brief before collapsing under the weight of dishonesty. Maybe the best thing Ethan could do was learn from it and make sure he never made the same mistakes with the next person who trusted him enough to be vulnerable. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it, probably another founder who'd tracked down his contact information, but something made him check. The message was short. The turning page. Tomorrow, 7:30. If you're interested in talking. No name, no explanation. But Ethan knew Victoria's number even though he'd never saved it to his contacts, had memorized it during those weeks when texting her goodnight had been the best part of his day. His hand shook as he typed his response. I'll be there.